I have worked the night shift at the General Hospital for almost 10 years. I've seen it, all unexplained deaths, people talking to dead relatives in their final moments, equipment turning on by itself in empty rooms. I thought nothing could scare me anymore. I was wrong. It happened on a Tuesday in October, 6 months ago. My car had broken down in the hospital parking lot after my shift, and it was nearly midnight. The mechanic couldn't come until the next morning, and I needed to get home. I live about 10 kilometers from the hospital, in a small town in the suburbs. Normally, I would have called a taxi or an Uber, but my phone was dead. The nearest bus stop was 2 blocks from the hospital, on an avenue that during the day was busy, but at midnight became a shadowy stretch of cracked asphalt and flickering streetlights. I walked there, clutching my bag against my chest, the sound of my nurse's shoes echoing in the silence of the night. The bus stop sign was faded, almost illegible. I could make out some schedules, but the last bus on that line should have passed at 11:30 p.m. Even so, I decided to wait. Sometimes buses ran late, especially the night ones with less supervision. I stood there for almost 20 minutes, watching the empty avenue stretch in both directions until it disappeared into darkness. Cars occasionally passed by, their headlights cutting through the night before vanishing into the distance. The cold October wind made the dry leaves dance across the pavement, creating sounds that my tired mind twisted into footsteps or whispers. It was exactly midnight. I checked the hospital clock, still visible from where I stood when I heard the sound of an engine. It wasn't the clean rumble of the city's modern buses. It was a harsh, uneven noise, like the engine was struggling against something. Mixed with the mechanical growl was a constant metallic screech, like loose parts grinding together with every movement. When I saw the headlights approaching, my first instinct was to step back. The light was yellowish and weak, flickering irregularly like tired eyes. As the vehicle came closer, I could make out its silhouette against the distant city glow. It was a bus, but unlike any I had ever seen in service. The body was old, probably from the 1970s or 80s, with boxy lines and small windows. The paint, once likely white with blue details, was now faded and stained. Rust streaked down the sides like brown tears, and several windows were cracked or completely dark. The most disturbing part was that, despite clearly moving, the bus made little sound beyond its irregular engine. There was no noise of tires on asphalt, no hiss of pneumatic brakes. It was as if it floated a few inches above the road. It stopped in front of me with a mechanical sigh that sounded almost like a human groan. The door opened with the screech of unlubricated metal, revealing a dimly lit interior under flickering fluorescent lights. I could see a few rows of seats covered in faded fabric, but most of the interior was swallowed by shadows. There was no driver in sight. The driver's seat was empty, completely empty. The steering wheel moved on its own, making small adjustments as if guided by invisible hands. The control panel flickered erratically, red and yellow lights turning on and off with no discernible pattern. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at that open door like it was the entrance to another world. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to enter, to run back to the hospital, and wait until dawn. But some strange part of my mind, perhaps the part accustomed to medical emergencies, was curious. How was this possible? What kind of technology would allow a bus to drive itself? And I was exhausted. 12 hours on duty, 3 emergency surgeries, 2 critical patients. All I wanted was to get home and sleep. I stepped onto the bus. The first step revealed a thin layer of dust covering the floor, as if no one had cleaned it in years. My shoes left clear footprints as I walked toward the seats. The air inside had a strange smell, not exactly decomposition, but something very old, like clothes kept in trunks for decades. The fluorescent lights kept flickering irregularly, creating a slow strobe effect that made everything seem to move in slow motion. I chose a seat near the middle of the bus and sat down, clutching my bag in my lap and trying not to think about the absence of a driver. The door closed with the same metallic screech, and the bus began to move. That was when I realized I wasn't alone. In the front seats, partially hidden by the shadows between the flickering lights, were other passengers. Not many, perhaps 5 or 6, but all seated alone, separated by empty rows, staring straight ahead in absolute silence. I tried to see their faces, but the shadows and flashing lights made it hard to distinguish details. I could see silhouettes, human forms, in clothing that seemed from different eras. A woman wore what looked like a dress from the 1950s. A man up front wore a hat that had gone out of style decades ago. No one turned to look at me when I entered. No one made a sound. The bus was moving. But when I looked out the side windows, the scenery outside made no sense. We were no longer on the avenue I knew. The streets were different, narrower, with old-fashioned lampposts and shops with signs I couldn't read. It was as if we were driving through an older version of the city, one that existed decades ago. I tried to stand up to speak to someone, but found I couldn't. I wasn't physically restrained. I simply couldn't make my body obey the command to rise. It was as if a gentle yet irresistible force held me in place. The bus continued through streets I didn't recognize, making turns that didn't exist in the real geography of the city. We passed cemeteries I had never seen, churches with impossible architecture, houses that seemed built in different centuries, yet stood side by side. That was when I began to hear the voices, low, whispering, coming from the other passengers. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was of intimate conversations, like people reuniting after a long separation. Occasionally, I heard a soft laugh or a deep sigh. When I tried to turn to see who was speaking, I discovered I couldn't move my head freely either. I could glance to the sides up to a point, but it was as if there were an invisible limit preventing sudden movements. Then one of the voices addressed me, first time. The voice came from the seat behind me. But when I tried to turn, I could only make out an indistinct shadow in my peripheral vision. Yes, where are we going? My own voice sounded strange in the dense air of the bus. No one knows for sure. It's different for each of us. The voice was female, older, with an accent I couldn't place. Some say we're going where we need to be. Others believe it's where we've always belonged. And you "Where do you think you're going?" "I'm going home. Finally going home." Before I could ask more, the bus began to slow down. I looked out the window and saw we were on a street. I recognized my street, but it was different. The houses were the same, but they looked newer, as if freshly built. The parked cars were old models I'd only seen in movies. The bus stopped exactly in front of my house. The door opened with the same screech, and I felt I could move again. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked to the door, glancing back once before stepping off. The other passengers remained seated, motionless, staring ahead. But for a brief moment, before the flickering lights plunged everything back into shadow, I saw the face of the woman who had spoken to me. It was the face of someone long dead. Her skin was paper pale, her eyes sunken too deep, and there was an ethereal quality to her expression, as if she was seeing something I could not. I hurried off the bus. The door closed behind me, and the vehicle continued down the street. I watched its yellowish headlights disappear around the corner, and then absolute silence. When I turned to face my house, everything was normal again. The cars were modern. The street looked just as familiar as always. It was as if nothing had happened. But when I reached my front door, I found something that made me question everything I had just experienced. On the doorstep lay an old bus ticket, yellowed with time. The stamped date was 1973, and the destination read, "Final Terminal, one way only." I've kept that ticket to this day. Sometimes, especially on night shifts when I'm exhausted and vulnerable, I take it out and wonder if it really happened, if that bus was real, if those people were real. But then I remember the feeling of being unable to move, the whispers, the dead woman's face, wishing me luck on my journey home. And I know that no matter how impossible it seems, it all happened. Since then, I've never waited for a bus after midnight, and I always carry a portable charger for my phone. Because I know that if that bus shows up again, and I'm vulnerable enough to step inside, maybe this time the trip won't have a return. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan. I saw things that forever changed my definition of what is possible in this world. I thought nothing could scare me anymore after the things I witnessed in combat. I was wrong. My story begins a year ago, on a particularly cold December night. I was coming back from a veterans support group meeting downtown. Those meetings always stirred something in me, hearing other men and women fighting the same ghosts that haunted me. Felt good, but it also reopened wounds I preferred to keep closed. My car was in the shop, so I had taken the last bus line home. I live in a more rural area on the outskirts of town, where the properties are large and the neighbors far apart. It's the kind of place where you can scream and no one will hear, which is sometimes necessary when the nightmares come. The last bus dropped me at the end of the line, still about 2 miles from home. Normally, the walk would have been no problem. 2 miles is nothing for someone who's marched with full gear through hostile terrain. But it was an especially cold night, with a cutting wind and the threat of snow in the air. The road to my property is a back road that cuts through open fields and small patches of woods. During the day, It's a beautiful, peaceful path. At night, especially in winter, it becomes a desolate stretch of cracked asphalt disappearing into the dark. I had walked about a mile when I began to hear the sound of an engine behind me. It was a sound I recognized immediately, even before I turned to look. The uneven rumble of an old diesel engine, the kind we used in some of the older military vehicles. But there was something wrong with the sound. It was too irregular, as if the engine was misfiring every few rotations. When I turned, I saw headlights approaching. At first, I felt relief. Maybe it was another bus running an extra route, or maybe a trucker willing to give me a ride. After years in the army, I knew when to ask for help, and a freezing night in the middle of nowhere wasn't the place for pride. I waved at the vehicle. As it got closer, I realized it really was a bus. But it wasn't like the modern city buses I had taken earlier. It was a much older model, boxy, shaped in a way that reminded me of the military buses we once used to transport troops. The paint was faded and stained, and I could see several windows cracked or darkened. The strangest thing was the way it moved. There was something too fluid about its motion, as if it wasn't really touching the road. It stopped in front of me with a sound like a deep sigh. The door opened. There was no driver. Now, I'd seen a lot of strange things during my service. Equipment working when it shouldn't. Communications coming through on dead frequencies. Things that defied logical explanation. But this was different. This defied not only logic, but basic physical reality. The steering wheel moved on its own, making small adjustments as if guided by experienced hands. The dashboard was lit, but the lights flickered in patterns that made no sense. It was as if the bus itself was alive, operating by its own will. I stood in the road for long minutes, weighing the situation. My military training had taught me to always evaluate risks and benefits before making a decision. The risks were obvious: boarding. A driverless vehicle was insane. The benefits was simple. I was 2 miles from home on a freezing night. And there was something else, a familiar feeling, one I recognized from combat. The sense of being in the presence of something larger than myself, something that operated by rules I didn't fully understand. I boarded the bus. The interior was dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. The floor was covered in a thin layer of something that could have been dust or ash, and the air carried a metallic scent that reminded me of battlefields. There were other passengers. They were scattered across the seats, sitting alone in silence. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed their clothing came from different eras. A man in the front wore what looked like a World War II uniform. A woman a few rows back wore a dress from the 1960s, and they all shared one quality I recognized instantly. They looked like people who had seen too much, endured too much, survived things they shouldn't have survived. It was an expression I saw in the mirror every day, and in the faces of my fellow veterans at the meetings. I chose a seat near the middle and sat down. The door closed behind me, and the bus began to move. That's when I noticed the landscape outside changing in ways that defied geography. We were no longer on the rural road I knew. We were passing through places that seemed to belong to different countries. different eras. I saw battlefields I recognized from my deployment's rocky hills that reminded me of Afghanistan, dense jungles that could have been Vietnam, beaches resembling the descriptions I had heard of Normandy. And then I began to hear the voices, soft conversations among the passengers, in languages I recognized and others I didn't. English with accents from different decades, fragments of German, French, maybe Vietnamese or Korean. They spoke of battles, of lost comrades, of homes they had never fully returned to. First time on the night bus. The voice came from the seat behind me. When I tried to turn, I realized my movement was restricted, as if something soft but firm was keeping me facing forward. Yes, where does it go? That depends. For each of us, it goes where we need to go. The voice was male, older, with an accent that reminded me of the older vets from my support group. Some go home, others return to battles that never ended, and some go where they should have gone if they'd had the courage. And you, where are you going? I'm going back to Kisan, 1968. There's something I need to finish there. Kisan. I knew that battle from military history, one of the most brutal of the Vietnam War. That was over 50 years ago, I said. For us, Marcus time works differently. A battle never really ends if it's still being fought in your mind. He knew my name, though I hadn't introduced myself. The bus rolled on through impossible landscapes. I saw ruined cities I recognized from historical photos, fields where battles had been fought decades before my birth. And gradually, I began to understand where we were going. The bus wasn't just a vehicle. It was a kind of moving purgatory, a place where lost souls from different wars, different eras, traveled in search of some form of resolution. Why am I here? I asked the voice behind me. Because you're still fighting your own war, Marcus. Because part of you never came back from Afghanistan. And because that part needs to find its way home. The landscape outside began to look familiar. Rocky hills, dusty skies, the kind of terrain that haunted my nightmares. We were approaching what looked like a distorted version of a military base where I had once served. The bus stopped. "This is where you get off," the voice said. "There's something you need to face before you can truly come home." When I stood, I found I could move freely again. I walked to the door, which opened with a sigh. Before stepping off, I looked back once. The other passengers were still there, motionless, staring forward. But now I could see their faces more clearly. They were soldiers from different wars, different eras, men and women who had given part of their souls in battles the world had forgotten. And all of them looked at me for a moment, silently, before nodding in a salute I recognized. The salute of warriors who had seen hell and survived to tell the tale. I stepped off the bus. I was standing in a distorted version of the base where I had served in Afghanistan. But it wasn't exactly as I remembered. It was more like the way my mind had stored it, magnified by trauma, twisted by nightmares, heavy with meanings beyond geography. I spent hours there, confronting the ghosts I had carried for years. I saw comrades who had died under my command, faced decisions I had made under fire, relived moments that haunted me every night. And in the end, I found something I had been searching for without knowing it. Forgiveness, not just from others, but from myself. When I was done with what I had to do, the bus was waiting. I climbed back aboard, and this time the ride was different. The landscape outside was calm, familiar. We were returning down the rural road I knew, toward my home. When the bus stopped at my property, I stepped off without looking back. I heard the door close and the engine fade into the distance, but I didn't turn to watch the headlights disappear. I went inside and slept better than I had in years. The next morning, I found something in my coat pocket that hadn't been there before. A scratched, worn military dog tag with a name I didn't recognize and service dates from the Vietnam War. I looked up the name online. It belonged to a soldier who had died at Khe Sanh in 1968, listed as missing in action for decades before his remains were eventually found and identified. I turned the dog tag over to the Veterans Department, who returned it to the soldier's family. But I kept a copy of the paperwork as a reminder that sometimes our journey home is more complicated than we imagine. And sometimes we need help from others who've made the same journey. Since then, I've slept better. The nightmares haven't disappeared completely, but they're less frequent, less intense. It's as if that bus ride closed a cycle that had been open for years. But I still look out the window on winter nights, especially when it's cold and windy, because I know that somewhere, on a road that exists between reality and memory, that bus is still running, carrying lost souls home. I had always worked with people in extreme situations, children in shelters, families in crisis, abandoned elderly. I thought I had seen every form of human despair, that I was prepared for anything life could throw at me. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened 3 months ago. It was a Friday in March, and I was coming back very late from an emergency call. A family where we suspected child abuse case that had required hours of careful interviews and coordination with the police. It was almost 2 in the morning when I finally left the office. My car was in the shop, transmission problems I still didn't have the money to fully fix. Normally, I would have asked a colleague for a ride, but it was far too late, and everyone had left hours earlier. Ride shares were expensive at that time of night, and my budget was stretched thin, as always. I decided to take the night bus. The nearest stop was a few blocks from the office, in a part of the city that was bustling with offices and small businesses during the day, but turned into a shadowy stretch of shuttered buildings and empty streets at night. The kind of place where you walk quickly and keep your keys between your fingers. When I reached the stop, I checked the night bus schedule. The last regular bus should have passed at 1:30 a.m. But there was a handwritten note scrawled at the bottom of the sign. Special service -2 a.m. I figured it was some extra bus the company ran for late shift workers. It was exactly 2 o'clock when I heard the engine approaching. But the sound wasn't what I expected. Instead of the clean hum of a modern city bus, it was an older, more tired noise, as if the engine was struggling, forcing itself to keep going. When I saw the headlights, I noticed they were different from normal buses. The light was more yellowish, weaker, flickering occasionally like drowsy eyes. As the vehicle came closer, I realized it was much older than anything still in service. It was a bus from the 70s or 80s, with straight lines and small windows. The paint was faded and stained, streaks of rust running down the sides like ancient tears. Several windows were cracked, and some were completely dark, as if blocked from inside. It stopped in front of me with a mechanical sigh that sounded almost human. The door opened, revealing a dimly lit interior, and there was no driver. The driver's seat was empty, completely empty. The wheel moved on its own, making small adjustments, as though guided by practiced hands. The dashboard blinked with colorful lights that followed no logical patterns. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at that open door, every instinct telling me to run. But it was nearly 2 in the morning. I was alone in a deserted part of the city, and I couldn't afford a taxi. And there was something else, a professional curiosity, a need to understand what I was seeing. In my line of work, you learn to make quick risk assessments. And as strange as it seemed, the bus didn't radiate immediate danger. It was strange, unsettling, but not threatening. I stepped inside. The floor was covered in a thin layer of what could have been dust or fine sand. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I searched for a seat. The air carried a peculiar smell, not unpleasant, but undefinable. Like many different people had been there over a long period of time. The fluorescent lights flickered irregularly, casting the bus in constant twilight. I chose a seat near the middle, set my bag on my lap, and tried not to think about the absence of a driver. The door closed, and the bus began to move. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. There were other passengers scattered among the seats. Not many, maybe 7 or 8, but each sat alone, separated by empty rows. And there was something peculiar about all of them. They looked sad, not just sad, but burdened with the kind of sorrow I recognized from my work. It was the expression of people who had lost something fundamental, something that defined who they were. An elderly woman up front wore an old-fashioned dress and clutched a photograph to her chest. A middle-aged man, a few rows back, wore work clothes and stared blankly out the window. A teenage girl near the rear wore modern clothes, but her posture carried a timeless despair. They all radiated the same thing: loss, regret, unresolved pain. And when I looked out the windows, I realized we were no longer in the city I knew. The landscape outside had changed. We were moving through streets that looked like they belonged to different decades. Houses from the 50s alongside modern skyscrapers that shouldn't exist together. Shops with signs in languages I couldn't identify. It was as if we were driving through a collage of times and places. First ride on the bus of lost souls. The voice came from the seat beside me, though I was certain it had been empty when I sat down. I turned and saw a woman about my age, dressed simply but in clothes from an era I couldn't quite place. She had a gentle expression, but one weighted with deep sadness. "Bus of lost souls?" I asked. "That's what we call it. Each of us here has something unresolved in life," she continued, her voice echoing as though from far away. "A choice we didn't make, a word we never said, a forgiveness we never gave." My heart raced. In life, Are you saying you're dead? Not exactly. She smiled with melancholy. We're caught between worlds, neither alive nor dead. The bus collects us when we're lost, when our pain is so great we can't find our way on our own. I looked around again, seeing the other passengers with new eyes. The elderly woman clutching the photo, maybe a mother who had lost a child. The man in work clothes, perhaps someone killed in a workplace accident. The teenage girl, so many tragic possibilities. But I'm not dead, I said, pressing my fingers to my wrist to feel my pulse. No, you're not. That's why your presence here is so unusual. The woman tilted her head, studying me. Sometimes, very rarely, the bus collects someone alive. Someone whose soul is so wounded, so lost, that it resonates with our frequency. I thought about the last few months of my life. The family case that had kept me at the office late, that child I hadn't saved in time. The sleepless nights filled with doubts about my career choices. The constant sense that no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough. What happens now? I asked. That depends on you. The bus will keep moving, passing all the places where each of us left something unfinished. For us, it's an eternity of contemplating what could have been. But for someone alive, she paused. There's a chance for change. Through the window, I saw we were passing a hospital. Not just any hospital, the one where I was born 32 years ago. I could see through the lit windows as if the walls were transparent. In one of the rooms, a very young version of my mother held a baby me. Each stop is an opportunity to understand, my companion explained, to see the connections we missed while living only in the present. The bus stopped, and I felt an irresistible urge to get off. The door opened with that same mechanical sigh. If I leave, you can return to your real life, but you'll carry with you what you've learned here. The question is, are you ready to face your own lost souls? I stood, my legs trembling. From their seats, the other passengers watched me with a mix of hope and envy. They knew I had something they no longer did time to make things different. I stepped off the bus and immediately felt the real night air against my skin. The smell of wet asphalt and car exhaust replaced the bus's indefinable scent. When I turned back, the bus was still there, but now it looked translucent, as if made of mist and memories. Through the windows, I saw all the passengers silently waving. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure to whom. The bus pulled away slowly, its weary engine echoing into the night, until it vanished completely into the darkness. I was standing in front of my childhood hospital, but it wasn't the same place I had seen through the window. It was the modern hospital I knew, where I had visited patients for social work cases, where I had held the hand of an injured child just last week. I started walking home, but with every step, I felt something had fundamentally changed inside me. The stories I hadn't been able to save, the cases that haunted me, they still hurt, but I now understood that making a difference didn't mean saving everyone. It meant being present for those who crossed my path, even briefly. 3 days later, when I returned to work on Monday, I found a note on my desk. It was from a family I had helped months ago, thanking me for believing in them when no one else did. It was the kind of letter I normally would have tucked away in a drawer, but this time I pinned it to the board above my desk, because I had learned something important on that night ride. We are not defined only by the souls we couldn't save, but also by those we touched along the way. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, when I pass an empty bus stop, I can still hear the faint sound of a weary engine carrying its lost souls through the streets of memory and regret. But now, I know that as long as we're alive, there's always time to do things differently. There's always another stop where we can choose to get off and begin again.